I want to welcome everyone to Temple Beth Israel. Thank you for being here, whether you're on Zoom or you're in person, for this important presentation on Christian nationalism. My name is Linda Ungerleider, and I met Dr. Evans in the spring when I invited him to be a speaker. In the intervening months, my knowledge of this topic has grown exponentially as being anti-Semitic and posing threats to my well-being. This is an educational presentation so that you can make a good judgment. I would like to ask Josh Mandel, Chair of the Social Justice Committee, to introduce Dr. Christopher Evans. Josh?
Hello. So thank you, Dr. Evans, for joining us tonight. Christopher Evans is a professor of the history of Christianity at Boston University. He's a scholar of American religion and has taught and published widely on topics related to the history of evangelicalism, religion in American politics, and religion in popular culture. Some of his books include The Social Gospel in American Religion and Histories of American Christianity. He's an ordained minister as well in the United Methodist Church, and he served congregations in central and western New York State. Today, he's come here to give us a presentation about the history of Christian nationalism and its ties to American politics, to anti-Semitism, and to democracy in general. I would like everybody to please give a warm welcome to Dr. Christopher Evans.
Before you start, they're getting an echo on Zoom.
Yep.
Can you disconnect from audio?
So just stand by, everybody, while I disconnect.
Let's just do two there. And no, go to Zoom and then disconnect from audio.
Okay. So just see the others.
Yeah.
No, there, go to Zoom here.
Okay.
That's that. Go to your microphone. Click with that. And you leave computer audio. I'll say something.
All right. We just got rid of the echo here, so I apologize for the delay in sound on my end. Can those on Zoom hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
It could be a little louder.
Welcome everyone
louder
here
would be good.
to this presentation. One of the things I would request of those who are on Zoom, if you could please mute your audio. I will take questions at the end of the presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to a good conversation with you all tonight on a topic that is very timely and something that I think is for all of the attention the topic of Christian nationalism has gotten in the media is still not very well understood. Tonight, I'm probably going to mention names and movements that few people have heard of, even those who come out of a Christian context are maybe not so familiar with some of the names that I'll be mentioning. But when we talk about Christian nationalism, it is a very, very much represented by a wide spectrum of movements. I have to say a little bit of a caveat tonight. I am, as was said in the introduction, I'm a religious historian. And as some of my current and former students who are watching tonight know, historians are prone to go down rabbit holes. And I have made it a vow to try tried to simplify things without being oversimplistic, because there are a number of different dimensions of this topic, and I'm very excited to be exploring many dimensions of this topic with you this evening. You're always going to find people who have a number of different definitions of Christian nationalism. And part of what I hope you take away from this presentation this evening are some resources that can get you started on understanding more about it, and also thinking in terms of the kind of educational work, both here and in other faith communions that are represented tonight may want to do in exploring this particular topic. As a base definition, I would define Christian nationalism as a movement promoting the false belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. This is something that runs through the rhetoric of a number of Christian nationalist movements. It's implied in not so subtle ways through many politicians, public leaders who represent Christian nationalist ideology. Its goal, in many respects, its explicit goal is to restore the U.S. to what it sees as the nation's biblical foundations, rooted today in a very specific and very narrow understanding of white evangelicalism. One of the things that I hope my presentation will clarify this evening is the meaning of the term evangelical. Hopefully, I'll clarify that a little bit. Hopefully, you'll not walk away tonight more confused about what that word means. One of the persistent themes among Christian nationalist organizations, I think, is this idea that the U.S. was somehow robbed of its Christian moorings and replaced by a variety of secular. Christian nationalists will often use the term pagan ideologies, and that these ideologies are responsible for eroding the Christian basis of the country. Now, when you look at a number of people that are often associated in the United States with the Christian right or the religious right, they will immediately point to Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s that ruled school prayer and public school prayer as unconstitutional. They'll always see that as the beginning of this wider tide of ungodly behavior, which ranges frequently to things like the promotion of abortion rights through the now overruled Roe v. Wade decision, and particularly today, I think, in the way that Christian nationalists have taken a very strong stance against LGBTQ+ equality. The final characteristic that I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about this evening is the way that Christian nationalists will propagate what you could call stigmatized knowledge. This often takes the form of widespread use of conspiracy theories and debunk claims that many believers really see as being the essence of these hidden truths. I think of during Donald Trump's first administration, one of his spokespersons used the term alternative facts. And I think when you talk about Christian nationalism, it does open up into a wide range of sort of what might seem to many people bizarre conspiracy theories that unfortunately thanks to social media, have oftentimes been raised up for many followers to being the truth. Christian nationalists have a lot of different emphases. One of the things that really comes out in the Project 2025 document that has gotten a lot of press over the last couple of months, which was created by an organization, a very conservative Christian organization, and an organization that really veers into Christian nationalist ideology called the Heritage Foundation. But it's an extremely patriarchal movement, and one of the things that we'll explore and talk about tonight is how Christian nationalists often use sometimes rather obscure texts from both the Hebrew and Christian Bible to make the case that society is in some ways not only oligarchical, but it's very much controlled by men, particularly in their worldview, white men. So in this, in their reading of biblical truth and the way they apply it to secular government today, their ideal society is one in which women are basically consigned to the role of being good mothers, nurturing their husbands, and raising children. Another theme that comes through Christian nationalism is what I would call a siege mentality. And this goes back to what I said just a moment ago. Christian nationalists have, again, sort of this idea that the country, because it was founded by Christians, is really reflective of what they perceive to be their values and the suppositions of Christian truth as they define it. And the interesting thing about a lot of white evangelicals, and this is a theme that has been evident for many years now, in a little bit I'll make reference to names like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson from a bygone era. And one of the things that they repeatedly emphasized was the idea that they were history's true victims. They were the ones who were being persecuted, not minority groups, not African Americans, not Muslims, not Jews. It was white men, essentially, who represented history's victim. And this is a worldview I think has been very effectively used by many of these Christian groups, so-called Christian groups, to promote the idea, again, that they are trying to take back what they see as rightfully theirs, based on the fact that America was founded as a Christian country, and they feel this urge, again, to really paint themselves as the true victims, even though they also claim that they are history's true insiders because of the role that they've had and perceived for themselves in this country. Probably the most bizarre aspect to many people is the kind of apocalyptic worldviews that Christian nationalists bandy about. One of the things that I'll talk about in just a little bit, beyond sort of the kind of bizarre end of the world scenarios that many Christian nationalists aspire to, the thing about apocalyptic thought in certain forms of Christianity is it goes to this idea of conspiracy theories. There are so many examples of this. And I'll mention towards the end of my presentation, probably the best known one that many of you have probably heard of is the so-called QAnon movement, which I haven't heard a lot about it recently, but this was something that very much played out in Trump's first term, where there were all of these wild conspiracy theories about different groups trying to take over the world. And it does, as I'll talk about, it also plays into some very pronounced anti-Semitic tropes that unfortunately various Christian groups have been using for centuries. Now, where does this all come from? Well, this is where the historian hat comes on. And I suppose you could blame some of this on the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism is, and I always emphasize this to my student, is a movement that breeds division. Now, Martin Luther, one of many Protestant reformers who came along in the 1500s, emphasized the, in some ways, very radical doctrine of what was known as the priesthood of all believers, that anyone could pick up a Bible and interpret it in a way that could be understood by lay people. So in a lot of ways, Luther believed very strongly that if people read the Bible in their own language, not in Latin, that was the prescribed language of the Bible in the Roman Catholic Church, everybody would come to the same understanding of what the Bible meant. Well, unfortunately, Luther quickly found out that not only did people disagree with him, but he didn't like the way people were taking the Bible. But this has been something, again, that I think has been both a very positive development in religious history, in terms of how, when you look at sort of the history of Protestantism, it's a series of movements that have been involved in a number of social reform movements, particularly when you look at different aspects of American history. You see religious leaders coming out of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish movements that have been responsible for a lot of progressive and lasting social change. At the same time, I think Protestantism has also laid seeds for the development of a Christian nationalist ideology that in some ways has very deep roots in American history. Now, most people who have lived for any length of time in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have probably heard of John Winthrop. John Winthrop was the first governor of what was known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and was responsible for creating the Puritan settlement made up of Calvinist Christians, people who saw themselves as religious exiles from England. And their goal was to create, in their own mind, a holy commonwealth. And Winthrop made this very famous speech: "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Now, that particular speech has been something that Winthrop has used. Okay. I've just been told I am not sharing my slides. Let me go here. How about now? Okay. Okay.
You may want to go on slideshow mode, though. Luther and Winthrop are on the screen.
Okay, so I talked, for those of you who are coming in, I won't repeat myself, but just very briefly will kind of underscore some of the things that I've talked about related to sort of the roots, the siege mentality, the apocalyptic thought, the patriarchy, and the idea, again, of how Protestant theology has really been responsible for creating a wide sample of different interpretations of the Bible that ultimately lend themselves to Christian nationalist thinking. Now, going back to our friend John Winthrop, when you look at these words, the city upon the hill, these have been picked up by countless American politicians since the founding of the United States. And oftentimes, the interpretations, I think, have been very helpful. Some of you might remember that when John F. Kennedy was elected the first Roman Catholic president of the United States in 1960, when he left Boston, left Massachusetts to go to Washington, and he gave his farewell address at the state capitol, he cited Winthrop, and he used this language in a very positive way to talk about how he was hoping that his administration would bring the best values of Massachusetts to Washington. And he used the language of Winthrop in a very diverse way, talking about the number of different communities that lived in Massachusetts, the values, as he said, of the Puritan and the Yankee, and the various ways in which he hoped that those traditions would create a more virtuous government and in his administration in Washington. The problem, though, there are countless examples of how politicians have picked up on this particular language, which was really meant to describe a very specific religious community of settlers in Massachusetts. The words of Winthrop have been used to promote American exceptionalism. It's a very fine line from talking about virtue and the idea of morality and ethics to the idea that the US is the greatest country in the world and all other countries don't measure up to how great we are. And there are a lot of examples of this, and I think in some way part of the ways that this language has been so appealing is that historically the United States has had a very strong dominance of white Protestants. As a religious historian, I always emphasize the idea that the US has always been what we would call a pluralistic society. There have always been a variety of religious groups that have come to the US and made the US their home. And certainly a part of telling the story of US religious history is talking about its diversity. But by the same token, when you look at different times in the US history, particularly in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, Protestant churches dominated the religious landscape. And part of what you see with the Protestant presence, again, you see Protestants involved in social movements, very involved in a variety of different efforts of social reform, but it also creates this mentality among Protestant leaders of, this is our country. So what is going on in the 19th century? Well, you have fights over slavery, and you have, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, the reality of Jim Crow segregation and rampant racism. You also have massive immigration. So this is a time period where many Jewish immigrants are coming to the US, as well as Roman Catholics. The pictures in the slide are taken from Harper's Weekly from the 1870s, and they illustrate the seed of xenophobia that many Protestants in the 19th century carried. The fear in the slide here is that the Roman Catholics are going to come to the United States, they're going to bring their false religion, they're going to have this very superstitious religion, but they're also going to bring their cultures from their own countries. So you have German, you have Italian immigrants, you have Irish immigrants, you have immigrants from Eastern Europe who are Catholic. So one of the persistent themes among Protestant churches really well into the 20th century is this anti-Catholicism. I was talking to a gentleman right before the presentation tonight about the 1928 presidential campaign of Al Smith, and how Smith was the target of all of the xenophobia, the fact that he was wanted to repeal the Prohibition Amendment to the 19th century. It all comes from a 19th century Protestant playbook of anti-Catholicism. And at a time period where public schools at the United States were heavily Protestantized. So for example, children would read from the King James Bible, Protestant translation. And the fear was that there were efforts of many Catholic leaders to pass legislation that would basically get the Bible out of public school, because Catholics didn't want to be exposed to a Protestant translation of the scriptures. So you see in the slides kind of these interesting portrayal. One at the bottom shows this very innocent looking schoolhouse with the shadow of the papacy descending on the United States. I mean, the idea, again, that the Catholic Church is going to come here and they're going to take over and they're going to push us aside. And the other one, I guess that represents the Pope with his entourage coming to the US, having their sights set on being an evil influence over the purity of Protestant America. So the seeds of this kind of what would blossom into Christian nationalism are there very, very early on. Now we come to the million-dollar question tonight, and the question that many of you probably want answered: what is an evangelical? Well, one historian said, somewhat tongue-in-cheekly, an evangelical is anyone who likes Billy Graham. I'm not sure how helpful that is, but I think what is interesting about that statement, though, is that when you talk about defining evangelical as a term, and historians have spilled a lot of ink trying to figure that out, it often comes down to the idea that they are Christians who hold to a very strong theology of conversion, that part of the emphasis they put on is sharing Christianity and working in their mind to convert people to their faith. It also, again, though, goes back to this idea coming out of the Reformation that to be an evangelical is to believe in the authority of the Bible. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go back even to the early 20th century, and you were to look at contemporary writings of different figures, you'll find that the words Protestant and evangelical were basically interchangeable. It really was used for many, many years as someone who was rooted in the precepts of the Reformation. But one of the things that starts happening, and this is as a historian, I'm being very brief here on this point, as you move from the 19th and into the 20th century, Protestant churches start splitting. And a lot of the emphasis becomes, whereas many Protestant churches have been involved in social reform efforts such as the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, by the end of the 19th century, for a variety of reasons, Protestants are splintering into a number of different churches that oftentimes put a singular emphasis on the idea of personal salvation. And this accelerates in the 20th century, where certain denominations in the 1920s broke apart over a number of different issues. There was a huge debate over the teachings of Darwin. Some of you might have heard of the Scopes monkey trial, which showcased these divisions between what contemporaries referred to as fundamentalists on one side and modernists on the other. Modernists being more liberal, progressive on a variety of different theological issues, and ultimately becoming associated today with what we would probably call mainline denominations. So when you look at Protestantism today, it's made up of, oftentimes represented by traditions like my own Methodist Church, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, and so on. But by the same token, you have a situation where people are also creating their own churches, their own network of organizations. And in many respects, by the 1930s and 1940s, many individuals who formed these more conservative churches were the ones that became the new caretakers of the word evangelical. And that moves us into what we see today, where I think that the word evangelical has gone from being a very broad designation to one, frankly, that has become more and more associated with a segment of the Christian right, and particularly of the white Christian right. But one of the things that I think is important to tell you tonight is Christian nationalism did not come about overnight. It percolated for years within a number of evangelical think tank organizations, new church denominations that developed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and also among a network of publishing houses and particularly Bible colleges, which really served as an incubator for the kind of ideology that became much more public by the end of the 20th century. Now, here's part of the story tonight that's probably familiar to a lot of you. Jimmy Carter in 1976 was elected. He called himself an evangelical, but then it didn't take long for many white evangelicals to turn against Carter and embrace someone like Ronald Reagan, who seemed to be the individual who was supporting a number of causes of importance to them. So when you look at the emergence, and I won't dwell too much on people like Falwell and Robertson, but they use the argument repeatedly, well, we were just happy doing our own thing. We wanted to be left alone, and we were very happy to have our churches and our Bible colleges and to basically stay away from the culture. But then the 1960s happened. Everything gets blamed on the 1960s in some way. But this was where many people like Falwell and Robertson used the argument Well, the culture, the secular culture it's infringing on our right to be Christians. So when I talked about a persecution narrative, this became very prominent to the kind of rhetoric that was used by people like Falwell and Pat Robertson. Now, in a lot of respects, when you look at this kind of strategy of the religious right, Falwell's Christian moral majority was to go right to the White House. So he'd love to have his picture taken with Ronald Reagan. Reagan made a lot of promises. He was going to pass an anti-abortion amendment. He was going to protect Christian institutions, and really didn't do a lot about it. So his movement over time disappeared. Then the Christian Coalition connected with Pat Robertson, and also an individual by the name of Ralph Reed took a different strategy. Their strategy was to work on a grassroots level. And I think this is a very critical time in the 1990s, because I think in a lot of states, this is where you really start to see the ideology of Christian nationalism take root. Some of you might remember 1994, Newt Gingrich, his contract with America. So that was something that fizzled out. But I look at the 1994 election as very important, because it was one of the first times where you see a wave of very conservative white evangelical Christians being elected to office. And I think it shows in some ways, and one of the scary things about the way aspects of the Christian right work, they tend to be very well funded, and they tend to be very well organized on a grassroots level. Let's see. So in a lot of respects, talking about sort of the question of how does this kind of come together into what we see now. And this, again, is the part of my presentation tonight that I think brings up a lot of names that probably most of you have never heard of, but they're very, very well known within Christian nationalist circles through educational institutions that these groups have created, think tanks, and individuals who I would call pseudo-academics. So the 1970s, you have very much within white evangelicals the idea. Of course, the US was founded as a Christian nation. They emphasize that theme. And one of the individuals who promotes that the most, for the last 40 years in terms of his public career, actually longer than that, is a guy by the name of David Barton. Barton has written numerous so-called histories that have become huge bestsellers, and he's been named repeatedly as one of the most influential evangelicals in the US. But a lot of his books return again to the idea of well, if you look carefully at the language of the founding fathers, they're talking about God all the time. Therefore, they must be Christians. And again, if you repeat a lie enough, you start to believe it. And he's very persuasive in a lot of his arguments. His book, The Founder's Bible, and a book that came out about 14 years ago now, called The Jefferson Lies. And some of you know that Thomas Jefferson, I mean, he was a deist essentially, and he basically thought the one sort of group in the US that he thought would save Christianity were the Unitarians, because they had a very progressive and liberal faith. I always see a nod there in the back. But he basically took what he thought in his Bible were the true teachings of Jesus. And so he cut out just about all of the Hebrew scripture and Christian scriptures and just picked up selected words from Jesus. Well, some of you are aware that evangelicals oftentimes will use what they refer to themselves as red letter Christians. The Bibles are printed always with the words of Jesus in the Gospels. So in Barton's reading, Jefferson was a red letter Christian because he really believed in what Jesus was teaching. But it reflects, again, I think, a mindset that is reflected in a number of things that Barton has been connected with. So he has been a major figure in the homeschool movement, which I'll talk about more in just a minute, in terms of producing educational materials. He is also a figure in what is called the Christian heritage industry. One of the books that I have on the reading list that many of you I hope will take home with you tonight, and it's up on a slide at the end of my presentation, was actually written by a former student of mine who did her doctoral dissertation on going to tour groups in these Christian heritage groups in DC. And again, what is very much part of the way that these groups operate, they'll find some reference in a document that references we believe in God, or we're a nation under God. And they use that again as sort of a script to develop the idea of, well, everything you've been told about history is a lie. We're showing you proof positive that this is a Christian country. So Barton remains very popular in evangelical circles. And again, he oftentimes has used the line when Jefferson Lies was taken off the market because good historians basically said, well, this is terrible stuff, and it's not based on any kind of critical research. He uses the argument, well, believe me, don't believe these scholars. And that's something you still see today. You can't trust people like me because I'm just perpetuating what they see as a lie. Now we get into some what might seem even like more obscure stuff, but part of what is so worrisome about Christian nationalism is it erodes the idea of the separation of church and state. This is something that people like David Barton promote, and it seems to have become more pervasive in American society. What once was a very fringe idea in evangelical circles has become much more mainstream. Now, the idea sort of, again, of looking at the Bible as a roadmap to creating both ordering secular society and religious society and blurring the distinction between the two owes a lot to a movement that developed in the 1960s called Christian Reconstruction. And the basis of Reconstructionism was the idea that if you look at the Bible, you can find ways by which you can organize society around patriarchal government. The founder of this movement, the one that is kind of revered in these circles, was a man by the name of R.J. Rushdoony, who started life as an Orthodox Presbyterian minister who wrote a number of different books that reflected, again, sort of this not only patriarchal society, but looking at that graph there, very hierarchical, the idea that things start, Christ is above all, and then you get down to the structure of the family. When you look at Project 2025, it's striking to me how many references to creating Christian families are in that document. In the hundreds and hundreds of pages, they always come back to the idea that family is the building block of society, and government is out to erode the basis of the family. So Rushdoony was just, from my perspective, heinous in terms of what he emphasized. So he gave a justification for slavery, saw the white Southerners as very noble. There were just a lot of ideas of Rushdoony's that were very, very fringe, that even within the evangelical community at large were rejected. But they continued to be circulated. And one of his disciples is a guy named Bill Gothard, who has been involved in an organization that has been at the center of the homeschool movement, promoting, again, the idea that you can't trust public schools, they're all secular, they're evil. And the curriculum that comes out of Gothard's Institute of Biblical Principles emphasizes this very, very strict patriarchal model. Now we get into maybe more familiar territory. a show I love to hate, 19 kids and counting, the Duggar Family, from a very popular TLC program. Jim Bob Duggar, the patriarch, had a lot of connections to Gothard's organization and is connected, again, with a fairly obscure and fringe movement called the Quiverful movement. What is the Quiverful movement? Well, it's based, again, on a fairly obscure verse from Psalm 127. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. So the Quiverful movement emphasizes the idea, basically, we've got to have a lot of kids. We have to kind of preserve the sanctity of the nuclear family, but expand it with lots and lots of kids. And part of the idea and part of the ideology of people like Gothard is, well, this is all the basis of, we're going to have these kids. They are going to be the Christian leaders, particularly the men, are going to be the Christian leaders of the future. On Amazon Prime, I believe it's still on Amazon Prime, there's a very good documentary called Shiny Happy People, which looks at the misadventures of the Duggar family, but it talks a great deal about Bill Gothard and sort of this larger movement that represents, I think, a very, very scary component of the Christian nationalist world. I don't want to say too much about this particular dimension because I've already emphasized it a lot, but I think there's always been that theme in white evangelicals since the late 1970s of being the truly persecuted group. Interestingly, one of the things that really galvanized the religious right when Reagan was running for president, Bob Jones University, a very strict conservative Baptist university in South Carolina, had very, very strict policies prohibiting interracial dating and very strict quotas limiting the number of African American students who could attend Bob Jones. Bob Jones lost its tax exempt status, and evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, said, there we are, we're being persecuted. This is an example of how our beliefs are not being respected. So it keeps snowballing. You can find different crises within the Christian nationalist universe that they will point to for the way that they're being victimized. Very interesting figure in this is a guy named Francis Schaeffer. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call Schaeffer a Christian nationalist, and indeed he was a very interesting figure. During the 1960s, he and his wife had they operated a chateau in the Swiss Alps, the Bray, that became a place where a lot of disaffected youth in the 60s and 70s would end up. And he kind of looked like a hippie. He had a very interesting demeanor. But the interesting thing about Schaeffer, he and his son Frank, and Frank Schaeffer has since recanted his involvement in this, but he made a series of films and published a series of books that emphasized the idea that once upon a time Western civilization was Christian and it had Christian values, and look what has happened with the advent of secular humanism. And this is, again, one of those expressions that is used over and over, I think, by people on the Christian right and among Christian nationalists. They make the claim that a wide spectrum of ideologies fall under that label. Probably the kind of Christian tradition I represent would fall under that sort of designation. But it underscores, I think Schaeffer helped popularize the idea among a lot of white conservative evangelicals. Yes, our country has been taken away from us by these false narratives, and we need to find a way to promote it and bring it back. Now, here is where things get really interesting. Christianity has always had an apocalyptic bent to it in certain ways. I mean, the idea in the early church is that very soon, if you read some of Paul's letters, the idea that Jesus was going to come back and the end of the world was going to come and there was going to be this final consummation of heaven on earth. Protestantism really stoked a lot of apocalyptic speculation. Now, for many people, including many, many Christians, I think the idea of sort of an imminent demise through cosmic means is really kind of far-flung fantasy. But as a historian, I always tell students you've got to take the apocalyptic impulse seriously, and how even when it's discredited, it keeps coming back. In the 1830s and 1840s, there was a group called the Millerite movement. And the Millerites were led by an upstate New York farmer, Baptist preacher, self-made, educated man, William Miller, who, along with many of his cohorts, spent a lot of time on biblical numerology. And through that was able to kind of construct this idea that Jesus was going to return in 1843. Now, a lot of people came to Miller's farm in upstate New York. They gathered, nothing happens. So William Miller says, well, wait a minute, I miscalculated. I left out the year 0. So then they gather at 1844, same thing happens. Miller, very disappointed, dies a few years later. Movement breaks up, but the idea behind this apocalypse doesn't go away very easily. And when I talk about numerology, you see this in both the Hebrew and Christian texts. There are references to a lot of numbers. And people who hold to an apocalyptic worldview spend a lot of time on 2 books of the Bible, the book of Daniel and the final book in the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is very, very difficult to understand, but it's filled with a lot of allusions to the end of history and the end of time. And the idea that in the very near future, Jesus is going to return to met out a final judgment on humanity. In the mid-19th century, there was a movement that became very popular in the United States and still, I think, is very popular today. And while not all Christian nationalists necessarily prescribe to this tradition, I do think certain ideas have rubbed off on a variety of Christian nationalism. But this is a movement called dispensationalism. And to make this very brief, I would say dispensationalists believe that history can be read in the Bible. So if you want to know the future, well, people don't really make it. This is all laid out. If you read certain texts of the Bible, you can get a sense of what is going to happen in the future. One of the most unique innovations that came out of dispensationalist theology is this pervasive idea of the rapture. Now, this holds that at a certain moment, true believers are just going to disappear from the earth. And they're going to be taken up to heaven with Jesus, and then you're going to have this 7-year period where basically everything's a countdown to Armageddon. Now, one of the things, again, I think with a lot of Christian nationalists, some are dyed-in-the-wool apocalypse. I mean, they really do believe that Jesus is going to come back at any minute. But I think others are attracted to some of the ways in which apocalyptic ideas are kind of spelled out. And a lot of apocalyptic thinkers, even if they don't necessarily believe the world is going to end right away, they have a fixation with Israel, both as a biblical principle and the reality of Israel as a biblical nation, and also particularly with Israel as it exists now as a nation. I have to mention again, when you see the way that some of these ideas of Israel play into conspiracy theories, there are a whole series of books written by two die-in-the-wool Christian nationalists, Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Tim LaHaye has a long record of what I would call mischief making in this regard. But LaHaye and Jenkins got very rich because they wrote a series of novels called Left Behind, which talks about what's going to happen to humanity after the rapture. But the thing about these movies, some are very low budget, but it's like every 5 years, there's a new rapture film that comes out. I love this picture. This was from a Left Behind remake in 2014. I mean, look at Nicolas Cage in that picture. It looks like he's staring at his agent. Like, how in the world did you get me in this crazy picture? But I think, too, where you really do sort of see the kind of fixation that at times either borders on anti-Semitism or in many cases crosses that line. So there's a long history, again, on a very heinous history within Christianity that emphasizes the idea that, well, before a final judgment of God occurs, there's going to be a mass conversion of Jews. I mean, that is something that is a terrible dimension in Christian history, and a lot of examples of this. I mean, in terms of Martin Luther, who first said very favorable things about Jewish people, and then when he realized they weren't going to convert to Christianity, turned to a virulent anti-Semitism. So the idea of chosenness takes on a new urgency in 1948 when the State of Israel is founded. And this is where you see, again, kind of, there have always been, again, sort of apocalyptic books. If you Google online, you could probably find, going back to the late 19th century, books that have been written about the coming rapture and how Israel is going to play a major role in that. One of the most popular Bibles still, not just among Christian nationalists, but in a lot of more mainline churches, is the Scofield Reference Bible, which was published in 1909, Oxford University Press, so very much a scholarly work of scholarship. But Scofield, who was not a trained biblical scholar, filled his book with all these annotations, and there are all of these references. Well, this points to the apocalypse, this points to the fact that there's going to be a Jewish state. We're going to get to the point, again, where everything kind of comes together before Jesus comes back. And this still remains, this particular version of the Christian Bible remains very, very, very popular. One of the things that I'm very acutely aware of, and I want to say this in all sincerity, I know that many of these evangelical communities are very supportive of the State of Israel, and they have been, in many respects, for both from a financial and from a public stance, been very supportive of Jewish communities since last October. And I want to be very clear, different Jewish communities need to make the decisions in terms of how to respond to these groups. It's not up to me as an outsider to say what Jewish communities should or shouldn't be doing. So I want to be very clear about that. But also I do know that there is, again, a very, very fine line in terms of these groups that on one hand are very appreciative of the contributions of Jews historically and emphasize over and over again the chosenness of Jewish people as being primary to God's covenant, even before Christians. At the same time, though, it's a blessing and curse, because when you get into reading these apocalyptic scenarios, and if you have the stomach to sit and watch any of these films, which are readily available on YouTube, it becomes very clear that Jews are also the villain in these various doomsday scenarios. And many of you certainly are familiar with the protocols of the elders of Zion, which came out of Russia in the early 20th century, a terrible anti-Semitic trove, emphasizing the idea of Jewish global domination. And when you delve into sort of this ideology of apocalypse, and I think John Hagee, who is a very public supporter of Israel, longtime Baptist pastor, I believe he's in San Antonio, TV ministry, one of these individuals that's been around forever. But he keeps coming back to the idea, for all of the ways that he staunchly supports Israel, he's also made some terrible statements about, well, Jews have brought suffering upon themselves. And very much, again, sort of the idea that there's this sort of hope put out that ultimately Jews are going to convert to Christianity. And for those who don't, well, they're going to face divine judgment. So there is a blessing and a curse about Christian Zionism. And I know, again, this is a very important topic that many Jewish communities have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with. But I do have to point out also that on many grounds, what's objectionable about these groups is they do continue to stress a long-time anti-Semitic theme that Jews who don't convert to Christianity are going to be damned. And that's something, again, that as a Christian who cares very much about fighting anti-Semitism, that I find very, very concerning. Almost done, folks, coming to the home stretch. I think it's important to mention that there are a lot of people out there that carry apocalyptic theology, and they're not dangerous. They're not interested necessarily in the idea of global conspiracies, and they're not interested in any kind of violent action against the US. But what has happened, and I do have to say this is really accelerated through social media, is the idea that these stigmatized beliefs get closer and closer to the surface, and they're put on an equal plane with other people who are trying to argue, in effect, that these ideas are utter nonsense. Michael Barkin, this is on my bibliography, a political scientist at Syracuse University, wrote a wonderful book. This was long before Trump came to office, but a very aptly named book called A Culture of Conspiracy. And he talks about the fact that so many of these kind of ideas about apocalypse, about Jewish conspiracy theories, the other types of conspiracy theories about other groups, they're not just hidden within religious organizations. And part of, I think, the scary thing we face today is these are beliefs that are widespread in the culture. And I think part of the challenge that we have when you hear people like Donald Trump talking about deep state America, the idea that these evil interests, these cabals are out to overthrow good Christian people and take over the country. They're omnipresent, and we really do face a challenge ahead. And I think a lot of it gets down to education. I don't have this on the handout, but I'm very impressed with some of the materials from a group called the Interfaith Alliance. They have put out some good information related to fighting Christian nationalism. I emphasized at the beginning of my talk tonight that Donald Trump is really, he's a mouthpiece of something that has been underneath the surface and bubbling up a long time. So even if Trump loses the election and disappears from the national scene, this ideology is not going away. I mean, I think one of the things as faith-based leaders, we're going to be dealing with these issues for a long, long time. and we need to be able to recognize it. I need to also say, and I probably should have said this earlier this evening, not everybody who calls themselves an evangelical is a Christian nationalist. There are many evangelical leaders who have taken some very strong stands against Christian nationalism and the ideology behind it. So it's important not to stigmatize, just because people will use that name to call themselves, to define their faith, doesn't mean that they're dangerous. But it does go back to the idea that Christian nationalist ideas really are very much just underneath the surface. I think sometimes living in a very progressive era, or progressive region in eastern Massachusetts, sometimes we can feel that we're safe from this. But we have to take a very close look around at our culture, in what is going on in different communities. And I think there's a lot to be scared about. The fact that we are so polarized as a nation. And there's very much, again, deepening chasm. And I hope, again, that one of the things that can happen long after the 2024 election is that temples, that churches, other places of worship, faith communities can really join together in an emphatic no towards this ideology and recognize it and do what we can to shut it down. I want to conclude by just saying, I love my country, I love my faith, and I think our faith informs a lot of who we are and how we vote and how we respond to different things in public. The fundamental problem with Christian nationalism, not only is it a false ideology, but it's taken the perspective that its voice and its voice alone can speak to the realities of a country that is fundamentally pluralistic. So thank you so much for letting me come here tonight and giving this presentation and being so patient with me. We do have time for questions and answers. For those of you who are on Zoom, I'm going to try to get to some of your questions if you want to post them. I'll try to read them and see if hopefully I can get to at least some of you online, but I want to start with the folks in this room. Yes, sir.
My wife and I are guests here, and we've already heard enough about this synagogue to know it's an extraordinary congregation. And you, as the first speaker we've met here, you're tremendously diplomatic. And my
comes from years of experience.
And in the classroom, you're respecting and encouraging views and that sort of thing. And my question is, at what point do you, as a professing Christian, decide this is a period where maybe I've got to be less diplomatic?
Yeah.
Because the people who are calling themselves Christian fail all the tests on the evidence, on their own evidence. So you can cause trouble by going down that route, or you can hope to turn the dialogue a bit. What do you do when you cease to be diplomatic?
That's a really, really good question. And talking about sort of the question of how you kind of move from being supportive and taking a kind of an ironic view to different people, and then really coming out in a parish setting and saying, for example, something's wrong. I'm in a very privileged position as a professor at a seminary and a university. So in some ways I do have it easy. And I speak to a number of people who oftentimes represent a captive audience. But I also say, and I know some folks tonight know me pretty well, both who are Zooming and some folks who are here tonight, I'm a pastor at heart. And one of the things that I say to students, you have to be, there's always for any kind of religious leader, you have to be, sometimes you have to be diplomatic from the standpoint of keeping your job. And just getting to a point of trust where people can hear you speak a perspective that's different from their own. What worries me a great deal is, I think this is not the case with all religious leaders, but I think at times people can easily give up on that, or assume that people don't want to be challenged. I think people, there are a lot of people out there who do want to know about this stuff. And I think too, one of the difficulties is sometimes the line is so fine between what is a healthy expression of faith and what veers into something dangerous. I serve churches with a number of people who I would probably call evangelical in a good sense. I mean, they had a very deep faith. The way that they spoke about their relationship with God was very touching. And their faith was that kind of conservative faith helped them get through very difficult lives. But I think it differs from community to community. Some faith communities are built for it. They want, you can have these conversations without ruffling feathers. And others, it's going to take a lot of effort. I remember I was on staff of a church many years ago where you had kind of an even number of people on different sides of the political spectrum, and they were both kind of tiptoeing around each other. But I do think one of the things that can start a conversation, and this is where, again, more of the pastor in me, is to be able to say to people, I love you, I don't want to harm you, but why on this issue do we disagree so fundamentally? That could be just a very basic starting point.
Thank you.
Let's see, I saw your hand first, and then Jeff, I'll get you.
Well, one question I have is, growing up as a young boy in Boston, the one thing that I feared the most was the Jewish holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because back then, in my generation, 70-odd years ago, the anti-Semitism was the Jews killed Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Now it's changed a bit where it says Jews will not replace us. My question to you, Professor Reverend, and you seem to relate to it, is Judaism in America dying? Are we in a war against the Christian nationalism?
Or the
we have to
left.
survive?
It's the same,
Yeah.
the left, the extreme left, now are collaborating with Muslims. So where are we? I mean, it's an equal opportunity. And when,
I agree.
And society, both in Europe and United States, when we become polarized, it's always the common enemy, it's the Jew. Blaming the Jew of all the evil that happened in the world. And what is disappointing here, that in America, where it's a place of many refugees.
Yes, it
many
is.
People who arrive here for prosecution from any place in the world, still the common denominator where you see both, as you see in Christianity and the extreme left, is the Jew is the enemy.
What you both said is very true, and there's so many dimensions to try to get at that question in a concise way. Is Judaism dying out? I don't think it is, but I'm not in the position, the best authority to direct that part of the question. That's something I'm sure Rabbi Ben would have conversations with you on. But
I can see the way things are going nowadays, and you make reference to what Donald Trump so much tonight. If he ever came out and said, I am the second coming, and he did it just what he just said, I'm going to save all you women from you don't have to worry about abortions anymore. If he came out and said, I am the second coming, I could see millions of people saying, yes, you are, come forward.
You see that happening, yeah, yeah, well, and the assassination attempts just completely validate that, where there's this total messianic language around Trump. But one of the things that really pains me, and this is something I've had, a number of conversations with people about, I'm very disappointed with a number of elements in the left right now, where the term that my students have heard me use over and over again, there was an ancient philosophical tradition called Manichaeism. And Manichaeism made a very sharp distinction between good and evil. And what I lament about right now is the country is so polarized. And part of what I find, I'll be very honest, what I find in the left, which concerns me, is kind of the sense of, well, we have to agree on every issue, and if you don't, then you're not one of us. We're going to cast you out. And what we should be doing, I think, and particularly in this day and age where I think building coalitions, and particularly if there's a concern of trying to keep people like Trump and his allies out of office, you need to build a movement that has people from different points of view. And I think what is so painful to me since last October, having even the basis of a conversation with many of my colleagues on the left is impossible, because you get this very stringent, well, how you can't be like that. You're wrong to think about that. And
could you give an example of a conflict?
Give an example?
Yeah, give an example of where that division plays out.
Well, I think certainly when you see the kind of anti-Semitism that has been generated by components of the left towards Israel, certainly again, I'm aware on college campuses, many Jews have.
I get it.
So you don't want to leave the impression, I trust, that you can have a conversation with the far right.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, I'm not sure if you can have that conversation anymore with the far left. I used to think you could, because I mean, I identify very strongly with kind of what you would call a progressive body, but this is where I'm probably going into a rabbit hole now, because I'm talking maybe a little bit off topic, but part of what I think we need in this country, which is disappearing, we need some kind of center. We need some kind of center to latch onto, to build some kind of coalition, and it's gone, and the fact, I've seen this in a lot of demographic changes over the last 20 years, that a lot of, particularly in rural areas, the way that they've gone so hard right, and the continuing polarization of a lot of communities that are, there's not a point of connection, and there's not the safe space to have some of these difficult conversations. I'm probably skipping over a lot of your questions, but it reflects in my mind, just the complicated, I'm wrestling with you on this, and I worry, and I feel a lot of the things you were expressing right now, and I don't like what I see happening. Yes, Jeff, I see. I'm sorry. You've been very patient.
Brother, could you go closer to the microphone so we can zoom?
Oh, okay. This one, Mike?
The one on the table right there.
Where?
Right by Chris.
Oh, good. Yeah, we can share.
Yeah, Jeff, you can. There you go.
to move and just talk.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Rabbi Jeff Faust, former rabbi here of this wonderful congregation, and it's nice to be back. So I want to thank you, Chris, for being the opposite of Manichaeism and reductionism. There's too much of putting on black hats and white hats. And but I'd just like to ask for on 2 points, maybe a few additional thoughts. One, on the notion of United States, those who promote the idea of the United States being a Christian country, about how they square that with the United States Constitution and the whole concept of separation in church and state, how they deal with that. And then the second one, on the notion of apocalypse, at least some streams that I've seen, that for the Jews who don't convert to Christianity, some of the Christian apocalyptics are looking to push Israel and the Arabs into totally killing each other.
Yeah.
And then the Messianic age can come.
Yeah, and that theme about sort of the apocalypse, where you have sort of the showdown between Arabs and Jews, that plays out repeatedly in the kind of rapture films that, like the Left Behind series. I said this before, and this is where I think we're facing such a huge problem, and I don't want to sound like a baby boomer in terms of talking about the evils of social media, but this is where I talked about sort of the idea of how stigmatized ideas get privileged over experts or people who have done the work and have been responsible for creating curriculums that emphasize the idea of a secular founding for the US. Now, did religion play a role in the country's founding? Well, yeah, I mean, people had expressions of faith and they never questioned. I mean, people like Madison and Jefferson were not disputing the idea of a higher power, and they also, if you read them very carefully, they saw the separation of church and state as a measure that would help religion prosper, and they were very accurate about that. But I think the idea again of there are so many shows. I think of the stuff that's on the History Channel now, which will talk about Nostradamus, or we'll pick up on some bizarre end time scenario. And if, as I said before, if you say something is true enough, people will start to believe you. And I have encountered in the past, where I used to teach, I did have students who were very much welded. I mean, they had read people like David Barton and sort of that narrative of, well, the separation of church and state is not well understood. It's a bit of an exaggeration. And Jefferson was really a Christian. So, and they looked at me with a lot of skepticism, and I told them, well, look at read the sources. Read what Jefferson said, read what James Madison said, look at some of these documents. And you're trying to reason sometimes with people, again, who are, and I don't mean this necessarily in a mean way, but their worldview is oftentimes shaped by a very narrow view of the way Scripture has been taught to them. So they're not looking at the Bible critically, they're looking at it from the standpoint, well, the Bible's telling me what is true. So, yes, and
first, just a comment. I always thought that the separation of church and state was not about keeping the religion out of government. It was about keeping government out of religion.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Could you repeat what you said?
Yeah. So the point made is that the emphasis in the separation of church and state is keeping government out of religion.
Not the opposite. Whereas now people seem to think.
Yeah.
But my question is, I'm still having trouble getting into the mind of a Christian nationalist, and I wonder if you could help me do that, Because what I don't really understand, it's got to do with the siege mentality that you described, but I don't really understand where the need to impose comes from. Because if they accept that they want to raise their, homeschool their kids, if they don't want to go to a drag show, they don't have to go. And if they don't want to go have an abortion, they don't have to have one. So I'm wondering if you could help me understand the mentality of imposition and the 2025 project.
Why do Christian nationalists want to impose on us, in other words? Yeah, that's a
Is
great...
there something you could help?
Well, I'll get to the gist of the question. The main part of the question is, why do Christian nationalists want to impose their values on us? And I think a lot of that, again, you get into some very complicated politics that lend themselves to the idea that the U.S. is really the privileged place of white men. So this is where I taking your advice and not be diplomatic. I mean, I think this is where racism comes into play. I think this is where sexism comes into play, xenophobia. I do, again, try to take a very diplomatic view when talking with people who come out of a more conservative background. And I have met many conservatives. I know, you might get an argument over biblical interpretation, but they're not interested in necessarily imposing their views on society. But this is where I think you see this, and I'll use the LGBTQ issue as an example, which really seems to be the thrust of a lot of what you see in Project 2025. The idea, again, that anyone who challenges both heteronormative understandings of what a relationship is, and also the idea that is, I think, very prevalent in Project 2025, when they talk about sort of the sanctity of the family and sort of the patriarchal structure and the roles of motherhood, it tends to limit the way that people who, again, are emphasizing a much more pluralistic, diverse society, they see, Christian nationalists, I think, see this bluntly as a white society. I think some Christian nationalists are very good at hiding their racism, others are not. Some are very good at hiding their xenophobia, others are not. But part of what you see, again, and I'm sorry I'm getting more political here with the election coming up, Christian nationalists, I think, have been very effective in promoting issues that other more conservative Americans are concerned about. So the anti-immigrant, the concern around issues of immigration, the big one, the sort of anti-woke movement. We don't want people to tell us about slavery. We don't want people to tell us about a history of anti-Semitism or that anything was wrong with America. So that is the drumbeat of Christian nationalism. And there are a lot of things that come up where people will say, don't let these other groups, these people who don't look like you or think like you, don't let them tell you that this country is bad in some way. So this is a message that appeals to people. They may not be Christian nationalists, but they like hearing, well, okay, we got to keep the immigrants out. We don't want LGBT people involved in sort of telling us how we should, what goes against what we think a family should be. There's a lot that just kind of comes down, crashing down on people, that reflects the sense of it's the MACA agenda. This is part of making America great again, and it's making it white, and it's making it defined around very particular understandings what is perceived to be, again, the sort of recovery of a lost past. Yes, ma'am?
I wanted you to address women, that umbrella image.
Yeah.
Why, I'm assuming from what you said, that there's no dissent among women.
Well, I mean, one of the books that I think, and I know again, we're probably starting to run short on time, but one of the books that I really recommend from my list, and it's one that I think many of you have come across, is a book called Jesus and John Wayne by Christian Dumais. And she talks a lot about the way that many dimensions of the Christian right fed into the feminist backlash that surrounded Roe v. Wade and the campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. You know, the idea, you know, don't let feminists tell us that we shouldn't be mothers. You know, we believe motherhood is intrinsic to what we're doing. And this is not.
Said that.
Sorry?
No one said they shouldn't be mothers.
Right, right. But it's when you take one particular dimension and you amplify it to the point where that message becomes so pervasive of the idea that the only way that you can be a true woman is to be a wife and a mother. So you preclude the idea of having a career. You scoff at women who don't have children. I mean, that's another thing that comes up in Project 2029, that women who can't have kids either by choice or because of circumstances are victimized. They're seen, well, there's something wrong with them. There's very much that message that emphasizes the way in which women are somehow unnatural if they don't have kids. Yes, Josh. Why not?
Yeah, so earlier you were talking about the privileging of sort of stigmatized belief over basically like experts, right?
Yep, yep.
And so I was wondering, this is something that I sort of see is that you'll have a kind of coalescing of people who don't necessarily actually agree on their perception of how things are and what reality is, but what they do agree on is sort of the conventional understanding of how the world is and what is true.
Yep.
You know, basically whatever the quote unquote normies think cannot be trusted. You know,
Yep.
we don't agree on anything.
Yep.
We don't agree
There's a deep
what is
state.
true and what is real, but whatever you've been told, that's definitely a lie,
Yeah.
and you're stupid if you believe that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that and kind of where that impulse comes from, because I don't just see it, I don't think it's just with regard to like religion, although
Yeah.
it's often, you know, that's part of it, but also I think it's a very strong element, just like I would say partially in American society as a whole, maybe in global society as a whole, like it's in kind of all aspects of society, right? Like people will, you know, even just basic things like, oh, well, government statistics about, you know, basic like social metrics, like what are different aspects of the economy doing,
Mm-hmm.
and like how many job openings are there, and what are the crime rates, and things like that are just like taken as an article of faith to be definitely not trustworthy. Not just like,
Yeah.
oh, I think
Yeah.
you should call this into question maybe, but like this is all definitely lies, right? And that in itself, regardless of what you think is the truth, is kind of taken as a unifying factor. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. So
The question, a lot of different components, but kind of the general idea of how do sort of these false claims become sort of the way in which certain communities latch onto them and become for many people truth. This gets into sort of a larger question for me about how there's been a long time process, I think, in the US of of kind of an erosion of public confidence in older institutions. And I think one of the threats to our society today is we are seeing the breakdown of a lot of institutions, not just religious institutions, but in government, in society at large, that are crumbling. And we don't know whether those institutions are going to change for the better, whether they're going to disappear, and if they do, what's going to replace them. I always think about, some of you again who remember Jimmy Carter, he made a very prophetic speech in 1979 where he talked about the US faced a crisis of confidence. And it was very prophetic because I think Carter picked up on a number of facts. As the US economy was coming apart, there were signs of trouble. And one of the things that I've always mentioned, when you look at sort of the way in which particularly a lot of white working class Americans have turned to Trump, they have some legitimate beefs. They have witnessed kind of the erosion of a kind of way of life that they took for granted for generations. And not many people are talking about, well, what are you going to do when these manufacturing jobs and different ways in which the economy used to support white working people, how are you going to sort of replace an economy that no longer works in a kind of media age that we live in now? So there is kind of that sense right there where people, when somebody says, I'm for you, I'm going to solve the problem, even though you don't have a plan for it, you're going to believe that person. And I say this over and over again, and I say this tongue in cheek, you know, I don't want to sound like an obstinate baby boomer, but I just am getting to the point, I think social media is dangerous, even though I'm hooked on it. Because it's true, you get, many of you have seen this, where you get feeds on an issue that is totally diametrically, you know it's not true, but it's being passed off as legitimate information. So in a society where we're becoming even more fragmented, and COVID didn't help there. I mean, we've lost the ability to engage in we're losing the ability to engage in face-to-face interaction. But I think in substitute for that, we easily glom on to groups that support our point of view. And I think that's true of all of us. And I think the unfortunate thing is more and more people who are connected are not necessarily, again, Christian nationalists, but they have a lot of anger. And what they do is when someone says something that, even though it's baseless in any kind of fact or reality, if someone says, you know, there are interests out in the society that are out to get you. And it's a fear, exactly. It's a fear. It's a fear. Sometimes it's a very legitimate fear of economic survival. It's a fear of change, and it's a fear of the unknown that takes a lot of different forms. So, you know, the idea of new immigrants coming in, they're going to take my jobs, they're going to take away my livelihood. Rational thinking, I think, just goes away. And there's a part of me, again, I can understand if you don't have a job and you're living on barely a minimum wage and you can't feed your family, you're gonna look to people who are promising you the world. But the question is, I think, and this is, you know, goes, I think, to the heart of Josh's question now. There's so many places where we can get our information, and that the fact that we can't regulate that, especially in election time, is just very, very scary. And I hate to end on a negative note tonight, but that's something I think we're going to be dealing with for a long, long time. One more question.
From Zoom.
Take a Zoom question. Okay, let me just look through this very quickly.
Louis.
A lot of good questions here. Was there a particular question, Mark, that you?
Ask Lois to unmute. And then she can ask it. Yeah.
There she is.
Okay, one question that I had was whether this fear that you talk about plays into beliefs in the apocalypse. I'm wondering what kind of psychological need a belief like that, a belief in the rapture or the apocalypse, would satisfy. And is it this fear that you're talking about?
For a lot of people who carry an apocalyptic theology, I think it's more a form of security. The idea of an apocalypse, and again, if you feel like you are one of the converted and you feel like when Jesus comes back you're going to be taken up to heaven, in a sense, you can kind of relax and feel like that you can do what you want with your life and not worry about the consequences. But I think, too, what you see, and you can go back to some examples of this. Many of you, again, remember the Branch Davidians from the mid-90s, David Koresh, who was extremely influenced by apocalyptic ideas, which no one at the time really understood. But I think what makes the potential for apocalyptic theology to become dangerous is when people feel like they need to give the divine a push. Now, one of the things that many of you remember, and it's all over social media, but one of Donald Trump's underling, a woman by the name of Paula White, who is a well-known in conservative evangelical. She comes out of a Pentecostal background. But she and other Trumpites were just going through holding these rallies, and they were like, you know, Jesus, we are summoning forces of the earth to, you know, bring in all of these angels from different parts of the world to make sure, you know, Donald Trump was your anointed to be president. And this election, again, they used that as a way to talk about how the election was stolen. And there are all kinds of videos on this on YouTube where she's just going, we're summoning angels from Africa and from the corners of the world. I mean, you know, for a lot of us, it's really ridiculous stuff. But the danger beyond, you know, and I fear, again, of the kind of crazy people Trump, religious leaders, he'll bring back if he's reelected, if he's elected. But the idea in some way, these apocalyptic figures, we got to give God a hand here. And that was something, I think, when you look at the Branch Davidians, that was scary about them. You know, the real militancy of well, we've got to protect ourselves because we're God's righteous remnant. And we could go on and on. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center, if you subscribe to their newsletter, they always point out, you know, what are called Christian identity groups, you know, which are essentially white nationalists who are preparing. You know, they're armed. They have militias that they've trained. These hate groups that are just widespread throughout the country. So there is, again, for a lot of us, we look at this apocalyptic stuff and we think this is utter nonsense. But it is very much a part of the religious landscape of the US historically. And as I said, there are many people who adhere to these ideas. They'll argue with you maybe, but they're not looking, you know, to create some kind of insurrection. But if you go back to the January 6th, if you look at the signs that were being posted, it really represented sort of an interesting cross-section of certainly a lot of secular ideology was mixed into this, but you do start to see some of this religious language around sort of the idea of a violent, You know, we're God's instrument. We're helping kind of advance the cause by taking over the Capitol so we could bring Messiah Trump into this area. One of the things I wanted to say, and I get the sense we are out of time. I want to thank everyone. If I can just go back and share my PowerPoint. I should have put this on. I want to see if I can get the slide up again. But just go back to the first slide of my PowerPoint so you can see that. I would certainly very much welcome your emails if anybody wants to reach out to me. My email is chevans@bu.edu. And for those, again, who didn't get an opportunity to ask me a question tonight or want to follow up on one of my responses, especially I want to thank the people who took the time to watch on Zoom. Please feel free to email me. I'd be very, very happy to answer any questions you had. And thank you for having me.
Just want to give a few brief thank yous to Mark and Andrea and Edie for your help organizing today, and especially to Josh and Linda for making today possible. And last but not least, Dr. Evans for this wonderful, informative, relevant presentation. Thank you. I just want to share what Dr. Evans, you shared about the ideologies of Christian nationalism and also on the far left. I think something in common is this certainty in your view of the world. And in our tradition, in Jewish tradition, there is this long tradition of dialogue and machloket l'shem shamayim, dialogue for the sake of heaven, and being able to, like Hillel and Shammai and their descendants, to live in the same community even with differing views. And I think you really model, not only what you taught, but you really model in your conversation how we can live together as a community. And God willing, we'll continue to do so here in Waltham and throughout our world. I want to wish everyone a Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and looking forward to seeing you on the holidays.